And good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Stephen Bell, and I'm on home turf here because I work in this School of Chemistry and Chemical Engineering, and indeed I often lecture in this very active theatre. However, the reason that I'm opening this evening's event is I'm also the Vice President for Research of the Royal Irish Academy. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you this evening to this panel discussion, which is going to explore the topic of ethical research. This is the second panel event in the Good Science discussion series, which is run by the Royal Irish Academy, and it's being programmed and organised by the Academy's Physical, Chemical and Mathematical Sciences Committee. Of course, we're delighted to be hosting the event here in Queen's. And the aim of the series in general is to facilitate public discussions that reflect on the idea of good science, and to address the important issues of trust, ethics, communication and public engagement in science. The first event in this series attempted to answer the question, what is good science? And this evening our panellists will be responding to the question, what is ethical research? We hope to learn from their expertise in this area, and they all have considerable expertise, and hopefully we'll come away with a greater understanding of why ethical research is important for good science. It's great to see a discussion event like this being organised by the Royal Irish Academy, which is in a unique position of being able to draw on expertise from right across the disciplines. This is an important and indeed, of course, timely topic, and I'm looking forward to hearing the diverse perspectives of our four speakers and our moderator this evening. Lastly, I'd like to recognise the efforts and contributions of the working group who programmed and planned this event, including Group Chair Peter Robertson, he's here somewhere, and the other members of the organising committee, Kevin Morgan, Leo Creedon, Christine O'Connor, Sylvia Draper and John O'Donoghue. I'd also like to thank Fionnuala Palfrey, who's the Programme Manager Sciences of the Royal Irish Academy, for all her efforts in keeping everything on track with the Good Science discussion series. So I'm going to sit down now, but not before I hand over to Professor Aaron Maule, who's our moderator for this evening. Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. My name is Aaron Maule. I'm Professor of Molecular Parasitology, and I'm a Queen's lifer, apart from 3 years in which I spent in the US at a pharmaceutical company. So I came to Queen's first in 1982, so I know all the creeks, and I've worked in this building at one time in a different era, mind you, so I know it pretty well. Great to see you here. I want to reiterate that welcome. It's a cosy audience, but hopefully we'll get some rich discussion when we get the panel engaged and hear their various perspectives on research ethics. I would like to say that this is part of this discussion series. This is the second of 3 events. So in the first event was framed by the phrase, what is good science? And it's really interesting if anyone has watched that, when you watch that very compelling debate, ethics comes up a lot. So research ethics is kind of a theme that's interdigitated with good science. And I think we will probably reflect on that today as we go through the various contexts that our expert panelists here will touch upon. So this event will have a subsequent event in November. But right today, we really need to drill in to the issues around research ethics, why we need research ethics, and why we cannot do good science without it. So first I'd like to introduce you to the expert panelists, who I will be leaning on heavily as we get into the discussions. Louise Dunlop, on my right here, put your hand up so they know who we're talking about. Yeah, is head of a Research Governance, Ethics and Integrity Committee here at Queen's University Belfast. Louise was appointed to United Kingdom Committee on Research Integrity, which was established in May 2022, and currently is co-chair on a work stream that is building evidence base to understand the scale of research misconduct in the UK, which might be something we touch upon. Our second panel expert, Dr. Cleona McGovern, is the head of subject in forensic and legal medicine and the Associate Dean for Students in the School of Medicine at University College Dublin. She holds a PhD in coroner's law and death investigation from the University of Sheffield, and she is also chair of Ireland's first National Research Ethics Committee for Clinical Trials. And you're very welcome. Our third panelist to my left, Professor Jim McLaughlin, is the director and co-founder of Ulster University's Nanotechnology and Integrated Bioengineering Centre and heads up the Belfast Region City Deals Centre for Digital Health Technology. He is a co-founder of various companies, including the wireless patient monitoring company IntelliSense, and has developed a wide range of industrial international academic collaborations, particularly in areas of nanotechnology, cardiovascular monitoring and diagnostics. Welcome, Jim. And fourth, last but not least, is Dr. Janet Diffin, who's a senior program manager within Health and Social Care Research and Development Division of the Public Health Agency, which distributes the Department of Health's Fund for Health and Social Sciences Research and Development in Northern Ireland. Janet's R&D portfolio covers a range of areas, including support for clinical and social care research, specifically in personal and public involvement. I think from their bios you can get maybe a taste of what they might be focusing on, which we'll come to soon. But just before I bring in their views on research ethics, a way of context for this discussion, we need to ask, well, what are research ethics? Well, really, it's in a way a moral framework within which research is undertaken. It's kind of a code of conduct that's there. Now, it's easy to recognize in some instances, being a life scientist, I easily recognize those elements of research ethics that are framed in legislation, because those frame work that involves patients, samples from patients, tissues, animal research, and they're all strictly regulated, where there is an expectation, in fact, it's mandatory, that anyone undertaking research in those in the UK or in ROI follow strict guidelines and apply the strictest ethical considerations. That's a must. That's before you start to look at any other complications within experimental design, etc. But of course, there's a lot of research ethics not framed by legislation, and in that there's a code of conduct that researchers, scientists abide by and expect each other to uphold to really see the full value of science. You can't have some researchers applying ethical considerations and others not, and expect the outcome to be as good as if everyone was on the same page. So I did take, by chance, look at our funders, the main funders of research on the island, and that would be both SFI in the case of science research in the south, and of course UCRI in the case of research in the UK. And when you look through their list of criteria that fall under the umbrella of ethical considerations, they are very broad. And I just touch on them here. It's a very complex topic. There's an expectation that you maximize benefit and minimize risk. A clear ethical consideration. You ensure integrity and transparency in all that you do within that research. You consider how participants in research are engaged. You embrace equality, diversity, and inclusion, and in fact promote it. You are clear on responsibility and accountability. Who is responsible? Where does the buck stop? And you address conflicts of interest. That is, you avoid them where possible. If it's impossible to avoid a conflict of interest, then you need clarity on what that conflict is. So then the other researchers usually who are judging the quality of that, whether it should be supported or not, for example, will know that there's a conflict of interest and will be able to gauge how that might impact the narrative that is provided in the research application or the publication itself. So we have a very complex and diverse set of criteria within which we need to apply ethics, and that makes it a very complex topic. And there are black and white areas that it's easy to delineate what is ethical and what isn't, but there's far more that aren't, where it's shades of grey. And that's where discussion and debate is needed. And one of the key reasons we're here today, in fact, the key reason, is to try and cement and encourage public trust in the scientific research that we do. And that is best engaged if we can articulate clearly and engage the public in the elements of good science and ethical considerations that are applied to that good science. So I'm going to introduce you to each of our panelists now. I've introduced you. I'm going to hand you over, to each of our panelists in turn, who are going to give their perspectives on what they see as key elements of ethical research. So to start off, we have Louise, who I think will be looking at doing no harm and maybe other elements in and around that.
Thank you, Aaron. This is working okay, yes. So good evening, everyone. I have the role within Queen's of establishing policy and creating the appropriate governance structures to enable the research that we conduct within the university to make sure that it's done with integrity and all of which is part and parcel of making sure that the ethical requirements are actually complied with. And it's the ethical aspects of research that are carefully considered, but that depends on what discipline you come from as to what actually is ethical within your actual individual discipline. When research ethics became more central to academic research, it was very much based around the medical model. And I have taken time to read this book, Alan Gaughan, Michael Burns's book on moral grounds, Lessons from the History of Ethics. And the central question in terms of ethics in clinical research is how to decide if an action is morally permissible. Since the Nuremberg trials in 1945-46, the principle of informed consent should have become an integral part of research ethics. And I use the term should because sadly that hasn't happened. Consent alongside respect and duty of care became central themes to ethical research, ultimately trying to minimise harm. Obviously, animals which are used in research are not in a position to give informed consent. Rather, the Animal Welfare Ethical Review Body examine applications for each of the projects to be undertaken, and they have the goal of trying to determine whether the planned study will create greater benefits to scientific discovery than the harm being caused to the animal included in the research. In this context, ethical research is research that benefits society through the contribution of knowledge that can eventually be used to improve health and well-being of people, therefore contributing to the health and well-being of nations. This principle of beneficence, whereby the benefits are maximised and the potential harms are minimised, is the particular topic I want to explore further this evening. I want to take the principle of doing no harm a step further and to bring it into the domain of trusted research. Now, what do I mean by trusted research? In this context, I am talking around the protection of national security or the security of research in local settings. This is where ethical research is considered in terms of end use and or whether the output could be used for a different purpose, as in dual-use technologies. What benefits and harms are found in new and emerging technologies? For example, facial recognition technologies were in the news at the end of last month. I don't know whether any of you picked up on the poor 19-year-old who wanted a bit of chocolate on her way home from work, called into the latest or her nearest home bargains, and was immediately captured by security and evicted from the shop because the facial technology recognition actually had decided she was a shoplifter. She wasn't a shoplifter. And they subsequently apologised to her for the mistaken identity. But as you can see, technology designed to be used for law enforcement, border control, retail, mobile technology, banking, financial facial recognition has the potential to be used and pose an individual threat to individual privacy and civil liberties. And I think you'll also know from various aspects of the media that it's well reported in international settings where minority groups have actually been targeted in their own country through facial recognition technologies, and it's a means of controlling those groups. So I believe the trusted research agenda brings a very different focus as to what is ethical research. Let me delve a bit deeper. How many of you have watched the last James Bond movie, No Time to Die? Show of hands. Okay, so I'm speaking to a few James Bond fans. For those of you who haven't, and there were a few hands didn't go up, just let me indulge me for a moment or two. because I believe these parts of that movie are relevant to tonight's discussion. M, the chief of the intelligence service, had oversight of Project Hercules. Project Hercules was a programmable DNA targeting nanobot bioweapon. What's important to the plotline is the scientist planted in the laboratory by MI6 was actually being instructed, controlled from an outside party, not by M, the chief of the intelligence service. In turn, the scientist had reprogrammed the nanobot to take out the members of a group known as Spectre, which had been the focus of the previous film some 6 years earlier. Now, cutting out some of the plotline and in the interest of me waffling and spending only 5 minutes on putting my case forward, James Bond unknowingly infects the head of Spectre with the nanobot technology. The plotline in No Time to Die demonstrates how research, in this case the nanobot DNA technology, that could have been used to manipulate perhaps genome sequencing and subsequently help restore tissues, prevent diseases, deliver anti-tumour drugs in cancer patients, has instead been used in a destructive manner. In whatever sphere of research you are involved with, be it chemistry, biological sciences, pharmacy, chemical engineering, medicine, it is important that in order for your research to be ethical, you need to consider and take steps to mitigate where the research outputs could possibly be adapted and used to harm others. Recently, the university here had the head of the Research Collaboration Advice Team with the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology come across as part of an exercise to increase awareness around trusted research. And in his talk, David Mosley said, there is only one output that can't be considered dual use, and that's the nuclear bomb. Everything else has the potential for dual use. My challenge is that as we think about our research, it is vital to consider at all stages, from the design, the execution, the reporting, what are the research outputs? What steps will be taken along the research study to achieve those outputs? Has thought been given to the outputs, or indeed the process, to get to those endpoints that could be used in a way that it hasn't been intended? I'm not saying that we should stop all research where is there potential for harm, but what I am saying is we need to give serious consideration in relation to all aspects that are actually involved and who all is involved in your research. We need to think about who's actually taken an interest in your research, who wants to visit your laboratory, who wants to work with you. Are they local people? Are they international collaborators? Why is it they want to come here? And we also need to think about how do we protect our technologies that are being developed. It's your intellectual property, and you need to indeed make sure that that is protected. So I believe that as anyone starts a research project, that these questions need to be considered and kept in the forefront of their mind. We need to outline and recognise the ethical matters from the very outset. Very often, research ethics is the last thing that people consider. By recognising responsibilities to society as a whole, then I believe we are undertaking ethical research. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That was very good. So I think with respect to how this discussion will move forward is that please, if you have any questions around what Louise said, keep them until the end and we'll come back to you. I think we'll work through our 4 panellists first and then we'll have a sort of joined up narrative around what they've said. Fiona?
Thanks, Aaron. From a lifer to a first timer. So this is my first time inside of Queen's, so very nice to meet you all. I am the chair of Ireland's first National Research Ethics Committee for Clinical Trials. So this had to come about, just to give you some context, because the legislation at EU level changed. And when the legislation changed at EU level, it became necessary for all EU countries to harmonise on how they approach the governance of research ethics. So throughout Ireland, it used to be that the local research ethics committees, usually run by the hospitals and or the universities, would review the clinical trials. And now what we've done is there is one national voice. So all of the trials come to one location to get one review, one decision, and it's harmonised across the whole country. So we started off with 2 committees, vastly underestimating the amount of work that would have to be done. And now we have 4, all looking at clinical trials. So the annual report has just gone in for the Minister to be published. And last year in the Republic of Ireland, we had just over 600 clinical trials reviewed by the research ethics committees. And of that number, 1 was rejected. And that would make you think, wow, everybody is so ethical. That is brilliant. Why? We don't even need research ethics committees. 1 out of 600. But then to give a bigger context on that. So because it has been a very disparate approach to how clinical trials have run in the country, and because we're trying to harmonise and streamline and target various areas of research throughout the country, there was a little bit here and a little bit there, and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. So there are very, very almost negligible, what we would call first in human or phase 1 trials. Hardly any, 1 or 2 out of 600. The vast majority of what we have spent our time either looking at substantial modifications or a new trial that has come in are phase 3 heading into phase 4. So they have gone through all of the hoops, probably elsewhere. And Ireland is involved in joining in a multi-site, multinational trial. That's typically what they are. And that is what we spend most of our time looking at. And because they are at that stage, so a clinical trial will be investigations before it ever gets to the human stage, then phase 1, which is first in human, then phase 2, then phase 3, and phase 3 typically looks at how effective and how safe this drug is. So it's gone through all of those stages. And phase 4 is usually post-marketing. It's out there, it's being used, and they're doing following up. So because we're looking at them at that stage, a lot of the hard yards has already been done. And that's because we're at the moment trying to pull everything in together. So the various funding agencies looking at what areas are we going to target, where in the country is best suited for medical devices, who has biggest access to the following criteria for various bits of research. So that puts it in context of what we're looking at. It's not that the trials that are taking place are inherently ethical, it's the stage that they're at. And at that stage, there are hundreds that are either wrapping up, or we're sweeping them up, or there's a changeover from the old legislation into the new. And that's the state that we're at now. There is also the perception that the research ethics is a thing you have to get. It's a hurdle, it's just painful. We want to do our trials, we want to do our research, and here's this committee picking it apart in the worst possible way, looking under the hood of everything, and just get through it and crack on with your research. That in particular for the NREC is an area we want to target, that it should not be a chore, that ethics and good research and ethical research should be part of what you do from start to finish and not just a box to tick. So that involves the NREC giving direction out to the scientific and research communities as to what is it that we want to see. The big area that we come across that is the hardest to deal with is informed consent. And you would think after everything that happened from World War II to the Nuremberg trials, that this should be clear. What informed consent is. How difficult is it to say, this is what the drug does, this is how we think it works, because it's a trial, so we don't actually know, this is how we think it works, this is how it may benefit you and others. Do you want to join in? Well, typically for every trial that we see, that short bit of information will be contained in a 60-page document of the most impossible language to work your way through. It is a legal contract. It is not a patient information leaflet. And that is what breaks our heart the most. We spend the most of the time looking at the pill, the patient information leaflet, and trying to decide, what are they talking about? And we're the committee that has looked at 600 of these things going, looks good, big words, lots of diagrams, don't know what they're talking about. How could somebody who's probably very ill understand what this document is? Some of them are so bad you can't read them. They are awful. And this is about informed consent. And this is what stops most of the research progressing. It's a legal agreement where you throw everything in there, even the most outlier risk, and expect the patient to make an informed choice. They typically couldn't, shouldn't, and it is impossible to do. So that is an area that we are really focusing on. And there are a few trials that come before us, and you open the pill and you're like, wow, amazing. I get it, I understand, I see the risks, the benefits, what my contribution could be, what might come after me. And those ones are typically designed with PPI, public and patient involvement, in that design. And when there is PPI involvement from the very beginning, that's when you really have a good understanding of research ethics in a clinical trial. And what is the focus? The focus here is to help people get well. Because what we see typically in the 600 trials that we're looking at is people engaging in research because it is last chance saloon. They are very ill. And they are doing it purely altruistically. It may work for them, but typically it is, if I can join a clinical trial, it might benefit me, but please could you learn from what has happened to me to help somebody else? And in that context, that is what the Research Ethics Committee focuses on all the time. That we want the research to be ethical, to look at the benefits that it might be able to bring. We can't say that it will have any benefit at all. That we will have looked as to whether the trial could even possibly work in the real world by having statisticians review it and see, is it underpowered or is it appropriate? And that the general public has trust that somebody has looked at this, a committee has looked at this and said, that is okay for you to participate in. Not in a paternalistic way, but that we've delved into the things that an ordinary member of the public could not possibly know about, because we couldn't possibly know about some of the stuff that comes in. They are huge. They bring in a massive amount of data. There is an awful lot of thought that has gone in behind it. And it isn't always big pharma trying to push some drug in. A lot of it is research sponsored by charities, by universities, by SFI. The vast gamut of funding that's out there are no funding at all. People wanting to do this research to have a benefit at the end of it. Maybe it's a naive view that we would have, that there is a benefit always going to come out of this, or that people are there to help humanity. Just as Louise said, you have to be very careful with some of the participating partners about where the data is going, about where the samples are being sent to. And again, with the EU regulation, that kind of helps. Because if there is a data sharing agreement and it goes into a safe haven, then we know. If it goes outside of that, then we're going to start asking questions. Who wants it? Why do they want it? Why is it being sent halfway around the world for storage? What's going on here? And we will push back and ask those questions. So that's what we're looking at. It's early days. We're only 2 years into this entire new system, and it has been a massive national transformation from the scattergun approach that it was to a single national voice. Well, that's what we're working towards, and we will see this picking up over the next couple of years with more direction to the research community out there. So thank you.
Thank you, Cleona. And now for a change of tact, Jim is going to talk about AI and nanotechnology.
That's at the topic. Good.
I thought.
No. Listen, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to the Royal Academy for inviting me. So, yeah, you've heard my background. I've been a researcher for probably a guts of 40 years. Yeah, I had a couple of years, I was a lifer as well then, at Ulster University. I had a couple of years experience of working in industry. And the background was an interesting start. I met a professor called Professor John Anderson. John would have been the engineer involved with the development of the portable defibrillator here with Professor Pantridge. And I think John's inspiration at developing device technology and medical device technology to get it into the home would have been way back in the 60s along with Pantridge in those days. And to this day, that's what a lot of our research attempts to do, is to take that, what we call the stack, that's the software and the engineering and all the materials and the devices part, miniaturize it as much as possible, keep the cost down as much as possible, and develop it so that you have high accuracy in the world of either therapies or diagnostics or surgical devices in that world of medical devices. So I got involved with John in setting up a research centre at one stage with about 100 researchers in it. These days it's not just as big, but we have big plans for the next stages of it. That centre was called NIBEC, and still is NIBEC, as we develop city deals here. And I'm leading up the new Centre for Digital Healthcare Technology. Now, in that course, I suppose, and developing research from fundamental materials, the nano aspect of it, and going on up that stack, we end up with AI. You've quite a lot of disciplines, multidisciplines to get in the middle of that. Just makes the ethics a wee bit trickier when you try to bring a lot of that together. But at the end of it, and I'll get to this point in a minute, at the end of it, there's a very, very important patient consideration and health and well-being consideration at the end of that. Considering when you start down these routes, you're about to spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of patient time, a lot of research time, so there has to be something at the end of it. So I got introduced to, I suppose, through research funding, and was very, very honest with you, the concept of responsible research when I started to go on to committees, etc. Started to get into it a bit more and started to understand the concept. And out of that came concepts associated with PPI, trusted research environments, etc. And I think it's only in this last, I was very, very honest with you, it's probably in these last 7 or 8 years we've structured our research to protect in that sense. If I go back when we were doing this in the early days, it would be a lot more empirical, maybe less structured. Could be argued, it could be riskier, but as we learned lessons, and as the world has learned lessons and best practice, we've tried to implement these types of structures. So when we look at medical devices, and I'm talking here about everything from, you're all familiar now with the lateral flow device, thankfully. You all know what the lateral flow diagnostic device is. We've been developing those about 10, 15 years ago. ECG monitoring devices, LVADs for helping hearts pump a little bit better with heart failure. Right through the blood pressure monitors and self-monitoring, or even that whole area of wearables that you all now wear on your wrist to measure your pulse ox. So I get involved in a lot of that, either at basic research level or commercial level. So what's most important, there's a lot of words that mean a lot to me that have been sort of mentioned already, and I know we're going to talk a lot more about PPI in a minute, but independent ethical reviews is very, very important for everything that I develop and see through. When I get to the end of a device, and developing a device can be, in many cases, 10 years, I've ticked a lot of boxes, and I've went through a lot of committees, and I've been to FDA, and I've been through patient groups, etc. And at the end of the day, when that goes into a patient hand, when it goes into a clinician hand, and even reached that commercial stage, it has to really, really work and do what it says. What it says in the tin, it should be able to perform with that specification. So one thing I've been very careful and learned from day one is when you start with the concept and you start with that idea, make sure you line all the ducks necessary up. So I'm going to just talk about some of those. So that independent ethical review that looks at social value, and what that really means, it should contribute to the advancement of knowledge, health and well-being in society. That's absolutely critical. I mean, I have colleagues, I sit on various committees in the university, from innovation right through to research committees, and I have colleagues that will do research for career's sake. They'll just do it because it's the right thing to do to get a publication out, whatever, and maybe that's okay, but public money is involved, and your claim is health and well-being. I think it should be better thought through. I mean, certainly if it's going into the public domain, I think to help further down the line or help other groups do beneficial, in my case, medical device development, then I think that's important. So really, really sitting back and trying to, is there a gap, is there a need, and is there a purpose to that? That social value is extremely important. Believe it or not, risk-benefit ratio, and I think that's been touched on at the minute, that's a hugely important one, how that's looked at properly. And those research benefits must dramatically outweigh any potential risks. Now, you might think, how can you evaluate that at day one? You can bring in experts, you can bring in what we'll talk about in a minute, PPI groups, you can bring in clinicians, and you can actually create that multidisciplinary team initially to look at the early design. So we hear this word co-design, co-development, co-ideation. And the reason it's extremely important, I think a lot of things can be stopped at the early stage or improved at the early stage if that peer review is conducted in an open and transparent manner. Now, that begs the difficulty with intellectual property. I can recall getting, I think it was 6 clinicians who were coming in their bicycles one day into a lab. I remember they were so excited about a piece of work that we were talking about. There was 5 professors and a couple of researchers in the room. I think it was 11 or 12 in the room at the time that we were discussing how we would do cardiovascular risk assessment in the eye. And we all come up with a brilliant idea. And within 2 or 3 months, we were doing the trial. It was ethically approved, I have to say, and it was taken through the Belfast Trust. And bingo, it came out with some absolutely fabulous results that could go to a next stage. The patent became an absolute nightmare because there was 12 people on the patent, right? And that's a very, very hard thing to resolve because everybody wants to get behind something that's going to quick impact and get from A to B to C. So that took a long time to resolve at that stage. But co-ideation, an absolutely brilliant idea. That's why it all happened so fast and why there was so much effort put into it. But it's got that difficulty. If you're going to impact, and I would have an argument with a lot of research that might sit on a shelf, if you're not impacting it and getting it out there, that itself, if there's a need for it, that itself is ethics in its own right. So in some ways you have to look at that whole pathway if there's potential of doing that. So risk-benefit ratio is important. Scientific rigor, I think it has been mentioned. Scientific rigor, there's no rationale these days for not getting stats right. There's so many excellent software packages for setting out your experimental design, etc., and getting the stats exactly right with that. There's a lot of universities will teach research methods. A lot of, in fact, in many research institutions, research methods is nearly fundamental to an understanding there. So research rigor is critical, but continuous peer review in that bit is essential. Fair subject selection and informed consent, I think 2 things that have been mentioned. It's a big trouble with us when we go into patient studies where you're going up to 1,000 and 1,500 and you're dealing with devices that are novel and very, very new. It's that patient data piece that's giving us the biggest concern. So I'm going to touch on that just in a minute, at how potentially we could move forward with a better trusted environment for handling data, and that's been one of our biggest obstacles. Why it's important is algorithms are controlling a lot of medical devices these days. Algorithms are making the decision for the clinician, or helping make the decision, or parsing the decision. As we move to self-monitoring devices, and you all, I'm sure, have tried a blood pressure monitor at home, there is an algorithm in there actually statistically processing those values that you put in from your systolic and diastolic waveforms, and it's giving you a value, and that value is worked on a clinical study that's maybe involved 200 or 300 patients, would you believe it? It'd be much better if that clinical study was involving 100,000 patients from a whole range of ethnic groups, for instance, and it was actually taking diversity and inclusion and putting that into the picture of the algorithm. So I would argue that the more data that goes into the validation of a lot of these algorithm systems is going to end up with better devices. So more patients should be consenting to certainly the medical device world to improve algorithm decision making. And that gets 10 times worse when we bring up the AI discussion, which we'll talk about in a second. So MHRA is the responsible body really looking after a lot of what I've just been talking about, certainly in the UK. And they have now put, and they have for a long time put, ethical and independent review at the centre of what they do. I'm not going to talk too much about PPI. PPI is going to come up from an expert here in a few minutes, but I think what's very important from us is I think we initially, when we looked at PPI, we took the UX. To many of you in the room, maybe have never heard the term UX, but UX is extremely important to us in the design of a medical device. Medical device should be intuitive, it should be easy to use, you should be able to pick an app up and just use it intuitively. So FDA nearly put 30 or 40% of the weighted approval against the user experience. Is it intuitive? Is it something that actually gives an answer at the end of the day that makes a decision? And is there a pathway right? Well, I was quick to realise that that's only a small part of PPI. And that active involvement of the patient and the public in research in ways that are appropriate then is extremely important for the co-design, for the conduct and the dissemination, and in order to be able to address research and things that really matter to people. That again, it's not just something nice for a loose well-being, but it actually does make a difference. You know, pedometers that you're all familiar with, 10,000 steps a day, I think we all know that. If you walk around a block so many times, but is there added value to something like that there, where it gives you a decision at the end of the day that really can make a difference to your overall well-being? And then I think the very important bit of it, from our point of view, certainly in medical device design, is expertise by experience. So anybody that you bring to a room, like a patient that's been using blood pressure monitors, for instance, for 10 or 15 years, will tell you the value of them. They'll tell you what's wrong and right about them. They'll tell you what they want in the future. They'll tell you how difficult it was to use, etc., or how often it needs serviced, whatever it might be. That information is extremely valuable feedback to that co-design bit, and that's a PPI bit that's very, very important for us. And again, it's NICE are very, very supportive of PPI these days because they want to bring that into their information, the feedback out to clinicians, and that patient piece is important, particularly in devices. And then to finish, the trusted research environment is the area that we're putting a lot of effort into at the minute. So that would be using techniques like federated computing. Effectively, the data never leaves the hospital. Your patient data never leaves it. But as a researcher in a university, for instance, I can interrogate that system with never knowing who you are or who the system is, nor the data never leaving that single place. That trusted research environment piece is extremely important. Our problem at the minute is we need the public to trust that trusted research environment, and that's a very big piece of work that we're attempting to do in specific areas at the minute. So for instance, there would be a cardiology group that we have worked with as part of the British Heart Foundation called the Heart Failure Warriors, and they're extremely valuable from the point of view of understanding what this trusted research environment we're developing at the Royal Victoria Hospital at the minute. So that's important for data protection. Approved researchers are the only ones that use it. It enhances collaboration. We've just launched the Encompass system here in Northern Ireland at the minute, and some very good feedback and some experiences in this patient data system that will eventually be available now to everybody in the Belfast area in the next few days, effectively. So that brings all the data together into one place and allows research then to validate in a much stronger way and improve devices. That will be an attraction for industry here and help the economy, etc. on top of that. But we need to have public trust, and that's extremely important. Just to finish, there are many other topics I could have discussed today. I should have really been discussing things like synthetic data. So we talked about harm in the world of data science. We have models now that are really accurate and very, very good. Blood pressure monitoring is not a difficult one to simulate. We know how the heart works, etc. So we can create lots and lots of simulated data for different data types. I would still argue that raw data, there's nothing to beat it because the human body is so different from one person to the next, and it's hard to beat that raw data set. I'm always looking for bad data because that bad data pushes our systems to the limit. But synthetic data is certainly one way forward, certainly in animal research. We avoid any damage or I suppose, denaturing or anything at all to cells or to animals. It's important to look at the synthetic data route. And just the final bit is we embrace EDI for 2 or 3 reasons. The equality, diversity, inclusion bit is extremely important in our world of innovation. Think of it, a medical device has to work in such a diverse range of cultures. Everything from the type of power supply you use, right through to the skin type that, for instance, a pulse oximeter will work with. I could tell you horror stories where so many devices were designed in California and white America, and of course could not scale up and work throughout the world. The other bit, of course, in innovation that maybe not everybody realises, but inclusion and having a diverse range of abilities in a research environment is extremely important, again, when you're looking at end user type design. And we've seen lots of advantages of a whole range of qualities of scientists and engineers working with us to help with that whole innovation phase. So on that, I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. John, over to you. I think
Yes,
PPI will live large again.
So I think the previous speakers have set my talk up quite nicely this evening. So I am going to talk about PPI, or patient and public involvement, or in Northern Ireland we call it personal and public involvement. But I'm going to refer to it as PPI this evening, just so you're all clear on sort of what it is I'm talking about. So what this means is that we're actively involving people, so that's patients, carers and service users in all aspects of the research process as partners rather than as research participants. And it's not intended for those public partners or public contributors, as they're often referred to be representative of any group or of patients or organisations. The intention is for them to lend their own individual perspective as a patient, service user or carer with lived experience of a particular illness, condition or service. So PPA contributors, and I'm going to just talk about them as PPA contributors this evening, they can become part of the research team, can be involved in the early stages of project planning and in shaping funding applications. They can be involved throughout the duration of the project itself, shape how research findings are shared and help influence the implementation of recommendations from that research into practice, or help influence new practice itself. It's important to note that involvement is distinct from engagement. Engagement is more of a one-way process where information and knowledge about research is just shared with the public. However, as we've talked about already, PPI can definitely help research findings to be communicated in a more easily understandable way. And indeed, health and social care research will be less impactful if people don't know about it, if the results are not accessible or not presented in an easily understandable way. And this is where PPI can be really beneficial, and for me is at the heart of ethical research. The literature tells us that PPI can also be beneficial in a number of other ways. So this includes increased recruitment to clinical trials, making research more relevant and appropriate for users, helping to develop research questions and shape or reshape the study design, informing the development of outcome measures or helping select which are most appropriate for a project, providing insights to inform and develop analysis, and as already mentioned, improve that understanding of the findings and I suppose help avoid that research waste. As we've touched on a little bit already, PPI contributors can also help to ensure the conduct of research itself is ethical and can help to shape those ethical applications. However, as we've touched on already, we shouldn't view research ethics as a one-off endeavour or something that you just need to get done to get started with your research. And ethics should be seen as an ongoing process and revisited throughout a project, and PPI contributors can absolutely help with those reflections. So whilst there's been an ongoing desire to demonstrate the benefits of PPI to the research itself, there's also an ethical argument for PPI in health and social care research. And I just wanted to share 2 quotes. Service users have not fought for a voice at the table to merely improve the research process, but because of a right to be there. And secondly, defining consumer involvement outcomes solely in terms of research quality ignores the rights of those being researched or likely to benefit from research. So we know that there are numerous benefits for PPI contributors themselves, and that includes increased self-confidence, knowledge about best evidence related to their treatment and care, supporting friendships that earn new skills such as communication, facilitation and presentation skills. So within HSE R&D division, where I'm based, we have our own internal PPI group called PEER, which stands for Public Involvement Enhancing Research, and they support us to implement our own commitments to PPI. And we run a series of learning and development sessions for them each year, and they tell us what areas they would like covered. And we actually just recently had a session on PPI and ethics, and the Co-Production Collective, who are based in University College London, came along to speak to our group. And there were a few messages that stood out for me that I just wanted to share this evening. One was around the power imbalances that may exist between public contributors and other members of the research team. And we need to be mindful of that. And they really reiterated the need to ensure that patients, carers and service users are involved from the outset and before any major decisions about the research project are made. Otherwise, these power differentials will be amplified. And they also talked about the need for research transparency and inclusivity. Research transparency is central to ethical research. Research needs to be carried out openly, and everyone needs to be able to see what's happening, what the outcomes of that research are. And PPI can really help with that research transparency agenda. So if we think about the point around that early involvement in projects, PPI contributors can really help shape recruitment processes, including how opportunities to participate in research are communicated, and help to ensure that findings are shared in that easily understandable way. But research also needs to be inclusive, to be ethical, and this refers to intentionally involving a diverse range of people. And we would refer to that now as underserved groups. And what we mean by that is a group that is less well represented in research than would be desirable from population prevalence and healthcare burden. Now, this can of course be context specific depending on the project. But why does that all matter? Findings from an analysis of 5 years of data of participants of the National Institute of Health and Care funded clinical trials showed that those areas with the highest burden of diseases had the lowest number of patients taking part in research. And they also pulled out a few other findings. Patients taking part in studies in heart failure were 20 years younger on average than real life patients. Patients in cancer trials tended to have no other conditions, and those in diabetes trials were not from the ethnically diverse populations that are typically seen in practice. So we know there are several reasons why it's really important to ensure that those underserved groups are included in health and social care research. And I suppose mainly that failing to include that broad range of participants means that results may not be generalisable to a broad population. Different groups might respond differently to an intervention, and only by studying the effects of that intervention in a range of groups can we be sure that balance of risk and benefit is favourable for a given group. If clinicians lack the evidence of an effective intervention for a particular group, they may be reluctant to offer that intervention to a group, and therefore clinical opinion takes the place of evidence. And successful delivery of intervention to target population is complex, as we know. Unless we've tested an intervention can be deployed effectively to different groups, we can't be sure that will work in practice. And finally, there's the principle of no decision about me without me, and that provides the moral justification for ensuring that underserved groups are included in research. The evidence base necessary for decision making by clinicians and patients must be generated by participation of a broad range of groups in the research underpinning that evidence base. So without more inclusive and therefore more ethical research, what we will actually do is reinforce existing health inequalities. And one way of helping to achieve more inclusive research is through more diverse PPI itself, and working with people from underserved communities to help inform and design research projects and ensure that that participation is more accessible. We need to enable people with different backgrounds and experiences to feel valued and motivated in patient and public involvement, and ensure resources are in place to support that work with underserved communities. One initiative that may help us work towards achieving that is a new partnership that we have with the Centre for Research Equity at the University of Oxford. And the vision of this Northern Ireland partnership is to advocate for research practices that prioritise inclusivity, equity and meaningful engagement with diverse and underserved communities in Northern Ireland. So just to finish with a short quote, involving communities in research is not just ethical, it's essential for creating solutions that are truly effective and accepted. Thank you.
I'm going to kick off, even though I'm the least expert up here, I just kick off and say what I have to say. Is that I'm just drawn to last week's very sad and untimely death of Dr. Michael Mosley. And we look at what he did. He did very public-facing experiments on himself, based on scientific data that had been published and rigorously tested. So he's on there, and he sold this in a way that garnered the confidence of the general public. They trusted him. And a lot of that, I think, was the ethical underpinning, was the desire to do good. So I think that sets a bar for what can be achieved, I think, in that type of communication. And we have to do better. We do have scientists, I have colleagues who would not be good at that interaction, but there's others who are really gifted at that. And I think we have to somehow engender the expectation that all of those with that gift do that engagement more often, more aggressively, to articulate the good things that scientific endeavour achieves. Over, yeah.
An answer, yeah. An excellent question, and I'm really glad there's PPI participation in the audience as well. So what is media?
Yeah.
We traditionally had an understanding of what media is, and that traditional understanding of media has been completely obliterated within the last decade. So media is this, okay? And this is what everybody has access to, and this is what informs and inflames the public debate. So when it comes to issues like trust around research or vaccines or whatever, it's whoever screams loudest, and whoever screams loudest on Twitter, now X, and then all of that anxiety that brings into the general public. And then you have to say, well, is Twitter media? Well, yeah, it is, and it drives the narrative, and it's owned by a billionaire, and what are his intentions and his approach? And then you start looking at this. So our traditional structures of how we even understand what media is and how that trust that some people in media brought into society has been obliterated. What can we do about that? That is a really hard question to answer in relation to medical devices and clinical trials. And just for those of you who have this in your pocket, and if you have a wearable device, I was watching rugby recently, brilliant Leinster team. And yeah, well, go for it while you're here. And a try was missed. I won't say which one, you probably know. A try got missed. And I hit the floor, going, bang, and I hit the floor. And the next thing you know, the watch goes off. It looks like you've been in a bad fall, a very bad fall. Will we call the ambulance service for you? I didn't even know that this thing is monitoring all of your impact and your velocity and everything. And then a colleague of mine said, well, did you read the terms and conditions? Did you give your informed consent when you opened that iPhone? No, I didn't. Yes, I agree. There is, 60 pages of stuff about what this thing is collecting on you all the time. It ain't collecting it now because I've turned it all off. And the options are there in the background as to how to turn it off, because the most special thing that we have at the moment is our personal data. And I want to know who's using it and for what. I don't want some Mr. Nobody knowing that I've had a really bad fall, even though I was only watching a Leinster match. I want to give my informed consent. I probably wouldn't object, but I want to have a say. And I don't want my say smothered by what media, whatever that means nowadays, tells me what it means. And that has a huge impact in the clinical trial space. And what is the most annoying phrase we hear? Yeah, well, I do my own research. That doesn't mean looking up stuff on YouTube and Twitter and forming an opinion and understanding what that means. But then, oh yeah, you would say that because you're in an ivory tower and you're an academic and you're just looking down on me and I'm just general, so my opinion is equally valid. And that false equivalency to someone who is an expert in their field and someone who does their own research by looking up stuff on YouTube, that's not the same thing. It's a false equivalency. And that's not understood. And I have to say that is a big failing in traditional media who have platformed that false equivalency. So the public trust, not knowing where to turn, has crumbled. That those traditional figures like Michael Mosley, who went out there, who explained and tried to give the trust to the people so that you would have ownership of your own ideas, I think that's gone. So for the likes of big companies like Apple and Microsoft, Google, all of those big companies out there, when we click the terms and conditions and we say, yeah, do we really know what they're collecting on us? And I would say the answer is no, we don't. By and large, we don't care, but we should, because in today's environment, we have to. And that puts a huge responsibility back on the one individual who's watching a match and isn't aware that Apple is watching you. And that's something we have to be cognizant of now. So that would be my comment on that. Thank you.
What would be interesting was those assessing those data if they saw a temporal aggregation of violent events in Ireland at a particular time during a rugby match. Okay, so two key questions around the issue of consent. One is probably
Okay.
your sphere.
Okay, to address first that consent is temporal. In the clinical trial space, yes, they absolutely should be coming back. Every time there's a modification and a step. Absolutely, and it is now a requirement that they do come back to the participant and say, okay, this goalpost has slightly changed now. This is what we thought we were going to do, or this is the arm that you were going to go into, but now we're going to go this way. Do you still want? So that is an absolute yes. So in as much as consent is temporal in the clinical trial space, that is absolutely what should be happening, is reverting back to the participants and saying what you originally consented to is changing, and now we are reconsenting for your ongoing participation. And that change also needs to come back to the Research Ethics Committee before it's put to the participants. That is what's known as a substantial modification.
Well, what if somebody wants to piggyback on the data and say, you've collected this data with patients for that piece of research, I'd like to do research on the same data.
So we see that a lot. We see that a lot about people wanting access to the data that has been collected in that particular trial. And the answer will be is if you want access to that particular data for your new study, then you make a new application and then you ask those participants, can that data be used? So that is absolutely how it should be working. Then to address your second point about the consent that has not been obtained by the patients for the sale of their data to Palantir, is that the company that it got sold to for the NHS that data got? I think it is. It's not for nothing it's called that. That's the sphere in Lord of the Rings, the all-seeing eye that can see everything. They named their company after that because that's what we're going to do. Watch you and see the all-seeing eye. That's not a coincidence. Do I personally think that was right? I think that is absolutely unethical.
The Eye of Sauron.
That the Eye of Sauron, would that kind of patient data would be sold on. That I just can't believe it, but it was.
No, just to say that actually whenever you are involved in research and you are going through your patient information leaflet and you are looking at that consent form, you will find that researchers will actually consent you for the reuse of that data. And that's something you've got to then decide, are you comfortable with signing and agreeing to that? Many researchers will actually give you the opportunity to have your data opted out or your human tissue opted out for future research, and you can express that. So it really does come down to carefully reading what's on that information sheet, what's on that consent form, and making sure that your wishes are very clearly made to the research team.
Okay, thank you, Louise. The second question in there was in and around the potential benefits of the research, clarifying what those potential benefits could be. And in a way, this also links to a wider question in and around open science, because we've touched on open science, and we've talked here about the regulation around clinical trials, but not all research is clinical trials, of course, based. So in that context, utopia would be that as soon as you do an experiment and have the data, you put it up, the world sees it. Because that's the most rapid way to exploit those data. The trouble with that is that it conflicts then with the potential to commercialize anything and have a product that you've protected with patents. So that would be something that you could pick up on, Jim.
Yeah, excellent question, and some great comments there about what I call social media companies that do monetize data, and it doesn't help this area in the slightest. It's bad. I try to coin a phrase that the type of systems or wearables or whatever it might be that we're using should be clinically relevant, not monetizable for the sake of profits and all the rest of these companies. So they do a lot of damage there. I also will mention I know a lot of ethical companies. Now you may notice when I was chatting there, I talked about industry now are trying to adopt responsible research and development and innovation. So companies want to declare themselves ethical. They really are getting at this concept that the whole pathway of data is fully understood. And I don't think many have gone to the full route of PPI. Just funny, as we speak at the minute, we're trying to set up an ecosystem here in Northern Ireland, and the main drive in there is EDI and PPI into companies to get that into their heads that will have an end value at the end of it, you know. Sometimes you look at makeup of an investment into a company, there will be philanthropists and there will be angel investors and VCs and stuff like that there. You look out for charitables, like Wellcome Trust would have invested in a company I would have been involved with, and they get a return at the end of the exit there. So that money goes back into research and is a 3 or 4 times increase. And cancer research that you're involved with would have similar schemes, and that's where you do see a really ethical approach to, let's call it profit, going back in. These spin-outs, it's often mentioned, you do see large exits. That maybe what you don't see is the huge volume of money that's been required to do trials and everything else in that. But I would agree with you at that consent stage, and the transparency that's needed about where that data could end up it's not good enough to just say it's anonymized. It's important to show what that could be used. If that's ever going to be monetized, I think it's a completely wrong thing to do. What should be done is you can do early stage trials at universities, etc. And it could go open source. That would need to be made clear to you. But then there's a re-phase when you enter into spin out, where that data then leaves the university. That previous stuff wouldn't be used unless it went back and consented. You go into a spin out environment, and it's the job of that then spin out or that next stage company to approach individuals and explain that this is now for a company and that's for the benefits of that. I sit on the equivalent of Cubis here at Queen's. I sit on IUL, and the ethics part and the whole governance associated with spin-outs has come under scrutiny over the last 5 years. And that's one area in particular. Because I know of companies that have got to the stage of the very last stage of exiting, and that area is too messy for further on investment, and then they're stood back because that area is not clean effectively. So not only is it IP that has to be clean and the governance of a company has to be clean, but now that data and how it was gathered and how it was ethically controlled is extremely important, from animals to humans. That is essential to get right. You can go back 20, 25 years ago, and I think there was a lot of mistakes made in those days. I think a lot has been learned. So we're looking for ethical companies, I think, is the bottom message here as we go forward. Yeah.
So really the question is in relation to whether we've gone too politically correct in the research ethics world. And I think we've got to look at the sensitivities that there are in relation to the research that's actually being conducted. And it's really through how sensitive that research is where the ethical judgment will actually come into play. And I suppose you might look at it then from the political correctness perspective because of sensitivities. So it really does come down to the ethics committee and how they view it. And I think the beauty about it, I mean, thank you very much for being a member, a lay member of an ethics committee here in the university. I think that's really important that we do involve people from outside the institution in our ethical considerations, and that we really do value your input, so thank you for that. But the reality is you've got a number of people sitting around the table making that discussion around whether the research is ethical or not. And everybody brings a different perspective. So for some, they may view that sensitivity as being too politically incorrect or too politically correct, and they might take that lens. Others will view it in a different way. And I think if your committee is working well, they should come to some form of consensus that actually looks at the ethics of what is trying to be achieved in the research. And through that and that consideration, that you do then come with that decision. Maybe we can pick it up over coffee, and I'll enjoy talking to you about just which committee you're on and what examples you have to bear. So thank you for that.
Right.
Yes.
So this is around trying to to speed up the process of approval if, for example, it is a very serious disease in an underdeveloped country, a pretty resource country?
Yeah, it's the problem with doing a clinical trial or that sort of research on an accelerated basis means then when it washes out in the end, the scientific rigor and standards that would normally be applied to the investigations and all of the various different phases, when that doesn't happen, it brings into question the validity of the outcome of the trial at the end, because it didn't go through the typical standards and the typical investigations that we would expect to see. But that is because they are the typical investigations that we expect to see. Our norm for understanding a clinical trial. Trials before human get involved, first in human, phase 1, phase 2, phase 2b, phase 3, phase 3b, phase 4, phase 4b. And that is how they have always been. Does it follow that that is how it always must remain? Potentially not. Potentially not. And there are different kind of trials coming on stream now that don't follow that path for exactly that reason. That there may come a potential other outbreak of an unknown pathogen into the future that will require rapid and fast investigation and, all hands to the deck to get in and look at this and see how do we control it before it takes us all out. COVID was one example of where that was going, and it was a fast mutating thing. There may be something out there way more deadly that we have no ability to tolerate at all, and it will just start taking out people, in numbers, unimaginable numbers. So in that instance, there is an ethical responsibility and duty to get in there and put our typical understanding of how we progress through that kind of research to one side to stop it, and then have the debate afterwards, potentially, did we do the right thing or not? Sometimes all you can handle is make decisions based on the evidence that is before you. There's a good novel about that in the developing world as well by John le Carré, The Constant Gardener. That's good, yeah? So that actually kind of addresses that and looks about the implication in developing countries of what big pharma can potentially do to influence a clinical trial. So it's a really good kind of thriller based around that.
Okay, we'll come to the last question. I think we've exhausted that one. And that was, can we predict or model how ethical a research application or a research output or activity is? Do you want to?
Yeah, just quickly take it, right? I mean, biology systems or systems biology is something that actually interests an engineer. We tend to, in engineering, look for a system. A logical system would be perfectly good, but we know every system is dynamic and needs data to feed into it on a continuous basis. Enter the world of digital twinning, which is becoming very, very popular from a point of view of product design. It's worked its way into the automotive industry very successfully. Clinicians are now looking at it successfully in the workflow area. So I've often thought, the other day we were trying to apply it to patent searching and stuff like that there, but we often thought maybe in the ethics and the trialing world, there could be something very interesting done there. There's a lot of decisions, there's a lot of concepts, there's a lot of data out there, from the published world, etc., that would be potentially fed into a model to give you rich advice or rich decision making. And then just to take it one stage further to kill off trials completely, there's been a lot of interesting work on the role of a robot in drug discovery and the role of continuous feeds into digital twins and robotic systems that would trial drugs synthetically before any human trial or whatever. And a lot of that sort of proven its worth very, very strongly. So it's just improved systems approaches and taking it into that sort of digital model world may have its advantages to help speed up what we're talking about, cut down the necessity to be continuously trialing in patient groups, etc., if that data starts to become richer and those models become better.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Fiona, you want to add a thought here?
Just a short thought about where do we see potentially this going, or maybe changing the rules that we understand. And it kind of feeds on from that. There is a lot of people looking at the area now about clinical trials and how we do it. How much longer is that going to stay in the era of AI? Because those large language models, those LLMs, are going to be able to predict the potential outcome on a lab project as to whether it's even worth trialing or not in a human population. Whether the drug that they're testing is ever going to bring about the performance that they expect. And I think in the not too distant future, we will be seeing more and more of that and less of how we traditionally would go about trialing and investigating on medicinal products. I think our traditional understanding of how we were doing it is going to fade away, and AI is going to feed into it because it can look at data, infinite amounts of data in the blink of an eye that we could never, ever, ever hope to address, and it can do it. So we look about our world today and a potential other outbreak or how we investigate and how we do. It's really, really hard to say where that's going, and I think it will be a very different space in a couple of years' time.
Okay, so I think we've okay. One quick comment.
Just one comment coming back to, I suppose, in the pandemic and studies for COVID treatments being fast-tracked. One of the things to sort of fall off a cliff was actually public involvement in those studies. And the Health Research Authority established the shared commitment to public involvement following on from the pandemic to really help drive public involvement in research again and get that back to the level that it should be at. So just to sort of share that reflection that there was a dip at that point, and there's work going on to get it back to where it should be. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Okay, everybody, I think it's time for a round of applause for our panel and yourselves.